When I think about unfinished video game franchises that I wish got to keep going, Darksiders ranks pretty high in my mind. The first two games were weird, biblical-themed, heavy metal-flavoured adventures that borrowed heavily from games like Zelda, Portal, Diablo, and The Prince of Persia, and they were way better than they ever had any right to be. But now that the franchise has continued with Darksiders 3, I kind of wish it had stayed dormant a little while longer. The game picks up at around the same time that the other games take place. War is imprisoned by the Charred Council for accidentally kickstarting the apocalypse, Death is off doing his thing, and Strife is... somewhere. Fury, meanwhile, is being tasked by the Council with tracking down and recapturing the 7 deadly sins, who have been set loose upon the Earth in the wake of the accidental apocalypse. Darksiders 3's premise is interesting enough, but there's very little to stop this from simply becoming a checklist to mark off. What the game does provide in terms of twists and subplots are kind of predictable, and so forgettable in the case of the latter that I actually forgot to go and resolve the subplots. The game's bland narrative isn't really helped much by the fact that the cast of characters are generally pretty unlikable, made worse by some final act character development from Fury that feels unearned and out of place. While the game's cast isn't really likable, they are voiced fairly well. Liam O'Brien returns for a quick cameo as War, Phil Lamar reprises his role as the delightfully creepy Volgrim, and Cissy Jones delivers a solid performance as Fury. Like I said, she's unlikable, but her voice work makes the best of some less than stellar writing. The rest of the game's audio is so-so. Darksiders 3's soundtrack is about what you'd expect, plenty of gothic-sounding orchestral and choral tracks, and fans of the series will be pleased to learn that the Puzzle Complete sound effect is still there and still fantastic, at least when the audio decides to stop stuttering and crackling for a few seconds. In terms of visuals, Darksiders 3 is equally mundane. The game flits between ruined cityscapes being reclaimed by nature and endless underground tunnels and catacombs, and there isn't really a lot on display that's particularly interesting. I will say that giving Fury's unlockable powers a visual flair does help her pop against these bland backdrops, and the designs of the sins themselves are probably a highlight of the game for me. They may not be anything super special, but I found a good handful of them weren't exactly what I was expecting, and the ones that were leaned so heavily into my expectations that it was hard not to be impressed. Now the actual adventure to find these sins, not quite as interesting or surprising. Darksiders 3 on the surface looks like a pretty standard action game, not too dissimilar from the previous games, but where they balance the hack and slash goodness with Zelda-style gadget-based puzzles, Darksiders 3 seems to just throw some power-based platforming into the mix. As such, the game feels like it leans heavily in favour of its combat, which wouldn't be a problem except the combat feels really bad. So, Fury has a whip, and at its core it's very fun to use. It's fairly quick, and the game gives you a decent number of combos to pull off right from the start. The problem is that with the game's much closer camera angle and the lack of any decent crowd control moves, Darksiders 3 feels really geared towards one-on-one encounters, and unfortunately the game just doesn't seem to realise this. It throws horde after horde of enemies at you and you're rarely equipped to deal with the situation, and it's all made worse by a few factors. Enemies deal far too much damage, enemies get super armor on a lot of their attacks for practically no reason, your dodge is mostly useless, and you get stun-locked so easily and so regularly. Seriously, I found that standard enemies were taking Fury down in only a few hits more often than not, and while beating enemies to the punch is a nice idea in theory, you can't stunlock them most of the time on account of the super armor, while Fury will get stunlocked by an errant wind if you give it the chance. And the dodge, it's so bad! Performing a dodge too early or too late will land you with a demon axe to the face, and even the perfect dodge doesn't make you completely invincible, so if you're attacked by multiple enemies at once, you can be hit out of your perfect dodge. And sometimes, you won't know when another enemy will attack because, like I said, the camera just is not suited to big group battles. Being attacked and killed from off-screen is just a thing that you'll come to accept. Now, Darksiders 3's boss fights do fare a little bit better for the most part, if only because they don't always throw a bunch of enemies your way. They do, however, deal a metric fuck-ton of damage, while the base combat just doesn't feel good, so it's hard to really say that these are a good part of the game beyond the boss designs. My problems with the combat aside, I will say that I did like the way the game handled unlockable powers. After the occasional boss, you're presented with a new elemental weapon, each of which ties a traversal power to it. Hell, some even have two tied to them. You've got a boost jump, a hover, a wall jump, and some of these powers even let you walk under or on top of water. Unfortunately, these powers are never really used in any engaging way. Every quote-unquote puzzle comes down to spotting environmental cues that relate to each power, and at the end of the day, they're basically just elaborate keys. There's rarely any need to use multiple skills at once, which might not be such a bad thing, since switching between powers is kind of unintuitive. Now, while the platforming and world exploration isn't super interesting, it's not the game's worst aspect. Darksiders 3's combat really is just the worst, and it isn't helped by poor checkpointing and death-based mechanics that, at their best, feel out of place, and at worst feel poorly ripped off from other, much better games. So, Darksiders 3 has corpse runs. You die, you drop your souls, you respawn at a checkpoint, and you have to pick them up again. But where other games with this mechanic have the level design to compensate for sparse checkpoints, Darksiders 3 just doesn't. Checkpoints can be absurdly far away from one another, and it's not until the last hour or so that the idea of shortcuts even occurs to Darksiders 3. It's also kind of annoying that only your health refills upon death. It leads to these situations where you'll use your generic Chaos Form Rage mode, or your Elemental Wrath powers as a get out of jail free card, but then just die anyway because the game is poorly balanced. So when you respawn, you're already at a disadvantage because these meters remain spent. And then there's the consumable power-ups that come with a cooldown timer on their use, as well as an ever-increasing price tag if you just choose to buy them, which you will, because they're the only thing that could make the combat bearable. It's just, none of this game feels well thought out at all. Darksiders 3 is bad. I didn't even talk about how the game constantly screeches to a halt to load new areas, or how the game crashed on me just as the final cutscene triggered, but even without all of that, the game is just not good. There are redeeming qualities, but not nearly enough to make up for the combat, which is the majority of the game. If you enjoyed the Zelda-esque qualities of the previous games, you probably won't get much out of this, beyond more lore that just doesn't resolve any of the series' previous questions or loose plot threads.